someone said to me very early on when I took on the role, I'm so glad we've got someone in this role. We need our culture to be right because we've got to offer a wider package to our people. Of course, we haven't always got it right, but broadly speaking, I think that people do recognise that it's not just about ping-pong tables. And indeed, we don't have a ping-pong table.
This conversation's over. Well, you can tell here we don't have a ping-pong table either. I think that's of expectations setting such a key part. I often find that as humans, we thrive when there's clear expectations, and I suppose the reality matches what we thought we were gonna get.
Actually, you should be focused on what you're trying to achieve and understand what the consequences are.
This episode is brought to you by Instant Impact. Instant Impact provides transformative talent solutions to small and mid-sized companies that are making between 30 and 500 hires each year. If your recruitment's giving you a headache and you don't know where to start, then give the team at Instant Impact a call or visit www.instant-impact.com for more information.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell. Today's challenging economic climate means hard times in almost every industry, but nowhere is that more the case than in white-collar professions. With many talking about a white-collar recession, businesses need to be more commercial than ever to compete. Now, this means the obvious cost-cutting, restructuring, and companies thinking more and more about what they can replace with artificial intelligence. But today's guest believes that it should also mean getting laser-focused on culture and on learning. Richard Alba moved from being a practicing lawyer into leading L&D functions at law firms and is now the Director of Development and Culture at Watson Farley Williams. Richard, I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Felix. Great to be here.
So I'm really interested. Your career has been a really broad-reaching one, but it was really, I think when we were talking in advance of the show today, there was a really interesting inflection point where you added culture to your remit.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just talk us through that, how you found that transition.
Great. Well, look, it was an interesting time. I was doing my learning and development, coaching, training, flying around the world, actually, and it was great. And there was a little bit of ego in it, if I'm honest with you. I thought, hey, my training's going down so well. Why don't I see if I can spread this magic to more broad workplace culture as well? And I can tell you the story later if you want. It wasn't quite as simple as that, as I discovered. But really, it was about understanding that you can do great training, you can do great coaching, you can do some good stuff, but you're never really going to shift the dial unless you are also looking at the culture you're operating in as well. So that's how it happened.
And did you underestimate the complexity of culture and cultural change then?
Enormously. I mean, it was like if I knew then what I know now situation. I've really enjoyed it. It's actually been the best period of my career, actually. But it's been very challenging as well at times. And I think one of the points is that having the word culture in your job title is quite interesting because it literally means everything to anyone. It's a very personal experience, your experience of workplace culture. It could mean you didn't get a pay rise. It could mean you don't like your boss. It could mean you have a fantastic team who you love working with. It could be about DE&I. It could be about collaboration at a senior level. And you could go on forever. It means different things to different people. So almost inevitably, as soon as you start talking about culture, you're talking about something completely different with everyone. So yeah, very challenging, but also rewarding.
Yeah, and it's unusual to have culture in a job title. I think if someone had a gun to my head and asked where culture should sit in an organization, my immediate thought would be that it would be one of the key responsibilities of a business CEO. How has having a culture remit in the organization, a specific person who is identified as in charge of culture, has that changed the way that the organization has functioned when it comes to culture as well?
I think so. And I think it's an interesting point because I don't think it's necessarily positive, at least initially. I think there's almost a sense that, well, if we've got a culture function. Does that mean we need one? Which I don't think is correct, actually, but you can get that. So one of the first things I did was create a committee, and that's low-hanging fruit and looking at those things we could do. And that's great, except, of course, if your pet project isn't on the list for whatever reason, then you instantly think, well, these people aren't doing it.
Mm.
So you can create a rod for your own back in that sense, where you it's not that you're over-promising and under-delivering, but you need to be constantly talking to people and explaining to people what's going on. So I think it is interesting. And I think the other thing is there's a Yes Prime Minister quote about the Department of Industry being the death of industry, or Department of Education being the tombstone of education. And I think there's a cynic's view that by creating a department, you are kind of putting a gravestone on it. And so what we've tried to do is to sort of lean into that cynicism in a way, and recognize that we in the culture team are not solving any problems with culture. We're not creating the culture. The culture exists in the people in the organization, and we're there really for two things. One is to look at it, to monitor it, to have our finger on the pulse of what's going on, and then to respond to feedback, to criticism, to positive things as well as negative, and say, okay, how can we, as an organization, respond to this and try and do better?
And is your whole team in the culture team, are you all aligned to both culture and development, or have you got culture specialists and development specialists?
No, they're separate teams. So the learning and development team is a learning and development team, and there's overlap between them. Everyone gets on well. It's small teams. So, the normal learning and development responsibilities, we do promotion programs, we do compliance training, we try and make sure people know what they're doing, say on feedback or appraisals and presenting skills, all the stuff. We do some fantastic career programs, which I won't get into here. It's a great team. And then we have a culture team. It's a small team. It's only two. Originally it was just one. It was just me. So there's three of us now. And they are data analysts and also with psychology background. So they bring together those two different skill sets. And honestly, I couldn't do any of it without them.
That's fascinating. So I want to go into two bits. Let's just focus first then on I find it really interesting that in you and in the and therefore in that intersection in the function you talked about just before, I find that pairing of learning and development and culture really interesting. Is it useful to you to have both of those in your remit in a way that maybe being an HR generalist with culture wouldn't go as far?
So I'd love to tell you that it was all part of a brilliant plan. Really, it was because I was interested in it. Mm. So I added them together. I think looking back now, or looking at it now, it's absolutely critical, because if someone comes to you, and learning development professionals will know this well, and says, I'd like you to run some time management training for my team or my people. So you learn to immediately say, well, I'd like to speak to the team first. And you often find that time management isn't really their problem at all. It may be the way the boss delegates. It may be the demands of the client. It may be competing interests from other teams that the boss either doesn't know about. And a million other things.
Could be time management as well.
It could also be time management. That is true. So there's all sorts of possible things. But what you do learn is that the first request isn't often the final outcome. So that's in learning. So understanding the culture you're working in then becomes critical, saying, okay, what is it they need? And that's in a very narrow context of one team or one person. At the more strategic context, because what was so useful when I added this was I also joined the management team of the firm. I sit on the operations board and reporting directly into the managing partner. So there was no barrier between me and the senior levels of the firm, which meant that you suddenly were looking at culture in a much broader context, because I was also hearing financial results and performance, and when things are going well, when things are not going so well. And that enables you to look at it in that context. And that's where I think it really the rubber hits the road, as they say.
Yeah, I guess speaking of, I've always found culture to be one of these fascinating areas where it's got a real duality to it. It's often looked at as quite fluffy, and yet it's one of the key things that's talked about, one of few things that's talked about at the highest level of the organization. Have you come across that sort of duality, and what can we do to make sure that culture is recognized as being an important driver of productivity rather than, I know, ping pong tables and dartboards?
Yeah, it's a good point. The idea of culture being seen as fluffy is interesting because, of course, culture exists whether we name it or not.
That's true.
Every organization, every place has a culture, and it exists of its own in its own way. So the question then is, if you are looking at your culture, what are you looking at, and what are you trying to do with it? And the assumption nowadays is you are talking about improved work-life balance or better facilities for dealing with mental ill health, or maybe DE&I, which comes into culture as well. All of which amazing things, and we work on as well. But of course, that's one element of culture. The culture is also about, how do we deal with our clients? How do we do our billing systems? Everything is part of your workplace culture. And I think part of the challenge is that it's been put into that box, which means that it tends to be, as you say, seen as, quotes, fluffy. And so, yes, you definitely do come across that. I'm very lucky. I work in an organisation that people recognise the value and importance of it. And partly, I think that's because it's a mid-sized firm, so it doesn't have the luxury of just assuming that the work will keep coming in and will be fine. And you have to compete with larger firms that can poach your staff and potentially pay them more money. So someone said to me very early on when I took on the role, I'm so glad we've got someone in this role. We need our culture to be right because we've got to offer a wider package to our people in that environment. So, of course, we haven't always got it right, but broadly speaking, I think that people do recognise that it's not just about ping pong tables. And indeed, we don't have a ping pong table. We did look at it.
This conversation's over.
But genuinely, because of the space we had, it was too noisy. I'm not sure anyone believed us, but we really did. We really did look.
Well, you can tell we don't have a ping pong table either. But dare to dream.
I once walked past a WeWork and had to take a picture because the picture had two people playing ping pong with the sign WeWork above them. And, for someone of my generation, I couldn't help but think there's an irony in that.
Absolutely right. So I'd love to get into, I think you mentioned a couple of times that cultures touches everything. If you're taking a sort of programmatic approach to culture, how do you distill something that covers everything into something that's focused on only a few elements, just so that you're not spread so thin that you're not having an impact anywhere?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked me this question 6 years ago because I didn't know the answer, as I discovered.
It's easy, really.
All you need to do is go around talk. So, look, it's been an interesting journey, and I would say I have the answer, but I've certainly got some answers. So there's two elements to this for me. There's one, you have to understand your business and your business model, and by that I mean how do you make money as a business, or what's your purpose? Because it may be the charity sector as well. What do you exist to do, and how do you actually do that? And that doesn't mean, say, if you're in a law firm, well, we have clients, we give them advice. What's the method? Are you charging absolute top dollar? So you're hiring the best and the best and paying them the top fees because that's what your clients pay for. Actually, do you need to have a slightly different model where you're using more tech and you're having more people on lower salaries, but creating more value for the client in that sense? You've got to really understand how you do that. So that's one element. And you'll note that none of those things would necessarily come under the box of fluffy. Mm-hmm. That's hard business stuff. And then the second element is you've got to know, in reality, what is life like for people? How on a day-to-day basis do they get the job done? What's their experience of that? And the only way is to ask them. And that could be through engagement surveys, it could be through conversations, exit interviews, all the other ways in which you talk to people. But of course, that they don't necessarily tell you the truth. So what's now called psychological safety, but fundamentally you've got to find a way of actually getting people to talk to you and to tell you honestly what they think. And that can be challenging. And I think that's where I came in. I was very lucky doing a lot of one-to-one coaching. People seemed prepared to share stuff with me, and indeed they continue to do so. And so those two things, working out, how does the business make money, but also what is the experience of people day to day, and then you start to bring those things together, and you can think, okay, now we can see where are the gaps, where is it not aligning, and that's maybe where the areas we need to focus on.
So, where you mentioned you had I'd love to just dig into a bit of detail.
Sure.
You mentioned a data scientist that you had in your someone with a data background,
yes.
data analyst. What data are you collecting? How are you feeding? How are you distilling that? How are you analyzing that in a way that's meaningful for the business objectives?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's actually two data scientists.
Oh, sorry.
Naomi and Darcy, fantastic people. And what's interesting is that Naomi has they both have psychology backgrounds as well. So that's a fantastic combination. And also, in Naomi's case, experience working in law firms, so understanding the business. So I think that's critical. You need people who are able to understand the business, but also are not just crunching numbers for the sake of it. Data is engagement surveys, of course, and other sources of data, whether it's formal or informal conversations. There's a lot of data we're not using at the moment, or we're only starting to look at it. So cross-pollinating, say, financial data with engagement surveys, said data, seeing how it matches. We've just started to do that. And then what they can do, which I certainly can't, is to start doing correlation, regression analysis, and those sorts of things, which then start to tell us, okay, this is what the survey says at a superficial level. Let's dig into it and say, why do we think some of these things are happening? And actually then can start to make some specific observations. So, for example, one of the great insights from our surveys has been the question, how many times do you have performance conversations with your manager? So it's a fairly standard question. And then you have, once a week, once a month, and the different answers. And when you map that on all the other questions, it gives a nearly perfect correlation between the more times you have performance conversations with your manager, the higher you score almost everything.
Wow.
Including things like pay and benefits. They clearly haven't changed because of that. And so that told us and tells us that if we focus on better performance conversations, we will improve metrics across the board, even on areas which have, in theory, got nothing to do with that. So that enables us, especially with a small team in a mid-sized firm, to be focused on things that will actually make the most difference.
That is absolutely fascinating. I bet you can pull some really interesting.
It's my favorite slide. I bring it out in almost everything.
I bet.
It's unarguable. And as I say, you can't just flick a switch and make it all happen, but you can certainly focus on things.
Absolutely. And it just seems like I really like that. It really closes the loop between the having a focus of it in the organization, sort of thing the CEO, for example, or sort of chief people officer is unlikely to be able to dig into. And then what I also really like is it sort of closes a loop between gathering data and a really straightforward, but I don't mean easy, but sort of an obvious intervention you can make to actually improve the culture of the organization.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why the data scientist is so valuable. So I have the experience I have, and for me it's all about understanding the business, talking to the people, and I can look at the data, but I can't necessarily analyze it. And so when we had a survey, I thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if all the bits of the firm that have the best engagement scores also have the highest financial performance? I was really excited. I thought that will show how great it is. And it wasn't that clear cut because life isn't that simple. So I was a bit disappointed. But actually, then you dig into it and you start seeing data like the one I've just described, or other metrics such as how belonging fits into feeling valued, fits into performance, fits into retention. And you say, okay, it's not as simple as I would have liked it, but actually there's some really rich stuff in here that goes to the heart of what people are worried about. You said to me, so I was just going to say, you said to me, do you ever come across resistance? People think it's fluffy. Well, they might initially, but if you then say to people, well, actually, is retaining your team important to you? Yes, absolutely. Or is managing between different generations sometimes a challenge? Yes, absolutely. Would you like me to show you some data that will give you an insight as to how you might be able to do this more effectively, and we can then prove that this makes an impact? Suddenly, people don't think it's fluffy anymore, because actually you've just named 2 or 3 of the biggest challenges they're facing, and at least in theory, some solutions.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up. I'm also really glad that you mentioned belonging and the, I guess, the positive impacts that people feeling like they belong in an organization can have on lots of other business performance metrics. I wonder whether you could just go into a little bit more detail into that point of data, because it's fascinating.
The data worldwide suggests that a sense of belonging has become one of the key, if not the number one, element for people feeling engaged in the workplace. That's perhaps not surprising coming out of COVID, although it's been trending that direction for a while. But as we said earlier, it's all about alignment with your business model. So in the legal industry, the last 10 years or so, there's been, and longer, there's been a lot of talk about well-being, about work-life balance, about creating a less stressful environment. There's a mindfulness charter that a lot of firms have signed on their clients. And obviously, because of the work I do, I'm hugely supportive of that. At the same time, the firms that really started to take over are the big US firms, and to the point where they've started to threaten the success of some of the, certainly the biggest of the UK firms. And we all know that the US firms work incredibly long hours, don't necessarily have a great focus on well-being, work-life balance, but they pay a lot of money. So how do you square the fact that those are the firms that are doing well with the fact that we've been talking about well-being and work-life balance for the last 10 years? And what that says to me is not that there's a hypocrisy, simply that they have got their culture and their business model in much better alignment than some other firms. They acknowledge what they do and how it's going to be, and they set the bargain that way. They pay a lot of money, they have incredible facilities, free food, great offices, sleeping pods, probably those sorts of things. And if you work there, you know what the deal is. Actually, don't like it, you can always leave. Mm-hmm. And so, for me, the key is not having a nice or not nice or whatever, however you define that. The key is simply that you have to have your culture aligned with your business model, with the reality on the ground.
And I think that's of expectations setting such a key part. I often find that as humans, we thrive when there's clear expectations and that they match. I suppose the reality matches what we thought we were gonna get, and that when it comes to mismatched expectations and when it comes to uncertainty, that's where there's a real level of stress. That's where people tend to leave their jobs. But it's funny how we're able to cope when we know what to expect.
Totally, and I think it's very interesting. So years ago, in a previous firm, when we'd had some bad scores, should we say, on surveys around culture, and I spoke to someone at another firm who I knew who'd done well, and said that, what's the secret, what's going on? And he said, well, what are your goals as a business? And I said, well, we're trying to improve profitability, we're trying to professionalize, we're trying to create a global business. And he said, and have you succeeded? And I said, yeah, well, actually, that's going really well. He said, so why are you talking to me? You just told me what you're doing, and what you're saying is that as the firm changes, perhaps culture's taken a hit. And perhaps that's not a surprise. Actually, you should be focused on what you're trying to achieve and understand what the consequences are. And I think that's really is the key point there, which is that you are that honesty. I think that's the word.
Yeah.
Honesty with what you're trying to achieve and what you want to be. And I'm not saying people are dishonest. That's not what I mean. I mean that because I genuinely believe that most people have good intentions and broadly speaking want to create a good working environment, and they certainly don't deliberately want to create a bad working environment, even if they're not aware. But their awareness of what is going on and how to do that is really often missing. So that's what I mean by honesty, just a really laser-focused look on actually what the business model is and how you make money, and then how that aligns with the culture.
Yeah, I think I really see how that's important and how powerful that can be if you get it right. Now, I think we've spoken a lot about why investing in culture is so important. I guess what happens when you get it right. What happens, and I know people are retrenching everywhere, and a lot of companies will have programs geared towards improving culture or codifying culture or whatever it is. What happens if thinking about culture takes a hit? What happens where it loses that direct external direction? Because as you said, all companies have a culture whether you want it or not. But I guess what happens when it gets cut adrift?
What you said is right. Every company has a culture regardless. You don't need to have a department with the word culture in the title to be looking at it. The real question is, how are you going to be successful as a business in a sustainable long-term way? And there are lots of ways to answer that question. So I was asked when I do leadership training, you look at the business model of, high concern for productivity, low concern for people. You might call sort of sweatshop model. And I ask the delegates, is this a legitimate way of running a business, taking your emotion out of it? And the answer is yes, you can run a business that way, and you might even be successful. What is the problem with it? And everyone says it's not sustainable. Correct. Now, that's particularly true in what you call a white collar, as you said, a professional business, but it can be true in lots of cases. So the question is not whether different business models may or may not be successful. It's how are you going to ensure that you can be successful in the long term? And in the modern world, where people are much more aware of these things and much more willing to move and to change for positive cultural experiences in the workplace, this becomes particularly important. You have the battle for talent, and talent will go where it wants to go. So making sure that you've got that right actually becomes the key. And so the danger for you isn't that your business might suddenly get bad scores in a survey. It's that the people you want to stay might leave, and equally the people you might want to leave might end up staying.
Wow, that is pretty poignant. It's definitely not what you want for your organization. I think you've mentioned you're in a medium-sized organization. Many people who are listening will be in other medium-sized organizations with smaller teams. No one focused on culture. Some will be in small organizations. I know we have a lot of listeners who are sole practitioners in the HR space themselves. What can they do? Limited time, limited resource. What are the I suppose 20% of the effort to get 80% of the return?
Look, it's a really good question, and it's one that I can't say I have a perfect answer to. I think the key is to be clear what you're doing and what you're not doing. So if you are in a team which has culture in the title or has got that remit, to be clear what bits you're doing and what you're not, so that people don't think, well, what are those guys doing? That's the first thing. Second is have a good relationship with whoever the people are who are going to make an impact. So it could be an HR person. It could be, if you're in the HR team, it could be an office head, an office manager. And who are the people who are influencing the culture? I think that's important. The other thing you can do is the listening piece, the finding out what people's experiences are. Now, you may not have the resources or the time to do engagement surveys. People sometimes worry about confidentiality. But you need in some ways to be talking to people. And the first thing there is to create the culture of trust, that people can talk to you, that it won't be repeated, that it won't get back to people, and that is a safe place to do that. I would say that it's always easier not to ask people what they think and just to do it, but it's always better to ask them. And even where I felt I'm the experienced person, I know this business, I know what the answer is, I have never not asked people and found out that I was at least a little bit wrong, because you don't know what people are thinking or experiencing until you ask them. So I think that's a key point. The other thing is, what are the things you can change? So I made that point about things like feedback and career conversations, focusing in on relatively small things, and not overthinking it. So another area we haven't mentioned the word is values. So a lot of businesses have corporate values on a website, or they may have it on a board. Often they have been produced in a vacuum by a management team, or maybe they've been produced, co-created in a workshop. But values, and some people are quite cynical about things like values, but what if you've got them, what are you going to do with them? And actually, it's more a mechanism for having a conversation than it necessarily anything that's going to change anything itself. So that's something that even in a small team you can actually do, and you can engage people, but you've got to do it in the right way. And I suppose the other thing is that, going back to that point I made at the beginning, is understanding the business. Are you someone who is realistic? So if you're going in suggesting a values refresh program, and you're going to hire consultants that are going to cost £100,000, but it's a small business that's having a difficult year, no one's going to thank you. So you've got to be in touch with the business, understand what is realistic, and make proposals in that way.
And I think that's so important. I think one of the big things that I would, if I were listening and I was resource constrained, one of the things I'd really come away from here feeling positive about is actually, if every business has a culture, every business would likely have a set of values, whether you've codified them or not. So those listening exercises are really just scratching under the surface and finding what already exists. And that then allows you, once you know what it is and where it starts, that allows you to think about, okay, well, this is how we improve it. And then it becomes a question of, how do you eat an elephant just a bite at a time?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I've learned a huge amount and really enjoyed our conversation.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Felix.